Dear viewers, Argentina is not exactly having its best moment.
Vamos a ver lo que es no tener para pagar una garrafa de invierno.
Mauricio Macri's government has had to ask for a bailout from the International Monetary Fund, and the truth is that in the last few decades, crises, devaluations, inflation, and payment suspensions have become commonplace in Argentina's politics and economy. Well, throughout this entire process, one political movement has had absolute influence: Peronism.
El peronismo es la búsqueda de las igualdades de oportunidades, la búsqueda de la justicia social, la búsqueda de la pobreza cero en Argentina.
Nosotros, los peronistas, somos el único partido político vigente en la Argentina fundado por un general.
But alright, what exactly is this political stream known as Peronism? How did it come about, and what impact has it really had on Argentina? Well, we're going to talk about it all on VisualPolitik in 2 videos, and in the first one we're going to focus on its origins and its identity, so listen up. First of all, who was Juan Domingo Perón? And most importantly, how did he manage to gain power and influence in Argentine politics for 7 decades? Well, to begin this story, we have to go all the way back to the 1930s. At that time, Argentine nationalism was in its golden age. Argentina was undoubtedly Latin America's great power. Despite the 1929 crisis, it was still one of the 10 richest countries in the world, and wages were much, much higher than in Europe. However, wait a second here, because in spite of this, the 1929 crisis had taken its toll, hitting the country hard. The tension led to the first military coup in 1930, a coup supported by many political, economic, and social sectors, especially on the conservative side of things. And under this militaristic, authoritarian, and nationalist panorama, it became customary for many officers of the Argentine army to be sent to Germany and Italy to take advanced courses. And, dear viewer, do you know who one of these officers was? Well, yep, that would be Juan Domingo Perón, who was sent to Italy, a country where he met and studied firsthand how Benito Mussolini's government was organized. And you know what? Soon after, he'd get the chance to put this knowledge right into practice. You see, at the beginning of the 1940s, Argentina was under the control of a corrupt and authoritarian government, a government that had perpetuated electoral fraud and attempted to stay in power at all costs. Under these circumstances, on June 4, 1943, a group of young officers in the Argentine army held a coup d'etat, supposedly to restore a transparent electoral system. One of these officers was our protagonist, Lieutenant Colonel Juan Domingo Perón. By the way, this was Argentina's second coup d'etat after the 1930s one, but don't think it was its last. Certainly not the case. During the next 30 years, the country suffered 4 more coups. The case is, dear viewers, that it was this 1943 coup which opened the doors to politics and power for Lieutenant Colonel Juan Domingo Perón. We can practically say that this is where Argentina's modern history began, so listen up. During the 2.5 years that the military government lasted, Perón's career was meteoric. This was despite the fact that until then he'd held a very low rank. Positions such as head of the Department of Labor, a position that in principle was, how do I say it, rather bureaucratic. However, hold on a second, because thanks to his political intelligence, Perón managed to use this position as a springboard for his rise to power. You see, from the very beginning, Juan Domingo Perón used everything he'd learned under Benito Mussolini in Italy, starting by winning some of the Union's support. That way, each time the Labour Department had to intervene in a conflict between employers and unions related to Perón, the former, the employers, would almost always lose. As you can imagine, this meant that this man's popularity didn't stop growing. In fact, shortly after, Perón was appointed Minister of War and then Vice President, all without forgetting the labor policies and the unions. Because if something was very, very clear to this lieutenant colonel, it was that that would be his political springboard. But he wasn't the only one aspiring to power, and so much prominence led to a lot of jealousy, so much so that the military leaders asked him to move away from the government in 1945. So we could perhaps expect this to be the end of this military man's political career, right? Well, no, nothing could be further from the truth. Perón had learnt how much influence the media could have in Europe, so he asked his superiors if he could say goodbye through the national radio network. They naively accepted, and Perón took full advantage of this opportunity. In his farewell message, he thanked the working classes for their support and questioned the continuity of the social benefits that he had promoted.
Para mí sagrada, me pongo desde hoy al servicio del pueblo.
It had a huge effect. In the following days, the unions mobilized in his favor, and on October the 17th, thousands of workers occupied the Plaza de Mayo, the nerve center of Argentine politics. The government, disorientated by the way events unfolded, asked the lieutenant colonel himself to appease the masses. And this is something he did, but only after agreeing that he'd be a candidate in the next elections. He also made sure that he had the support of the public powers. Juan Domingo Perón had managed to become a candidate, but now he needed to win the election. As we've seen, at the time Argentina was under military control, so government authorization was required to hold meetings, and electoral acts were no exception. Of course, Perón's campaign actions were almost automatically authorized, while his opponents, well, let's just say the process was much slower. And not only that, but Perón also had complete access to the most important means of communication at the time, the national radio station, because it was owned by the government. But that's not all. Under Perón's insistence, the government approved paid vacations for all workers, as well as additional salary at the end of the year. These are all things that make you look very good to your electorate. And there was still a move this genius of political strategies managed to use very well. You see, the State Department of the United States itself intervened in Perón's rivals' campaigns, publishing a report known as the Blue Book, where Perón's activities and those of his military allies were shown to support the Nazi regime. However, Perón managed to turn this around and morph it into something like a struggle between himself, who represented Argentine's sovereignty, and the United States. In the end, all these tactics, copied years later by populist governments throughout Latin America, won the elections for Perón. The victory, it wasn't overwhelming, but it was enough. A very important fact here: when Juan Domingo Perón came to government, Argentina was one of the 10 most prosperous and richest economies in the world. The country was even an international creditor. Countries like the United Kingdom actually owed it money. Thanks to all of this, the new president had more than enough resources to launch his political program, a program based on 3 pillars: political sovereignty, economic independence, and social justice. In practice, he transformed Argentina into a kind of army under the command of a single leader, its president. Thus, Perón managed to nationalize a lot of companies, especially those related to public services such as transport, energy, and communications. He also placed banking under governmental control and approved a lot of foreign trade restrictions. And he also achieved a lot of popular support. So how did he do it? Well, he did it by maintaining utility rates even below their cost and hiring a lot of employees for the government and for governmental companies. And it's certainly not so much of a coincidence that the Kirchners 60 years later did practically the same thing. Of course, all of this involved a lot of spending, and, well, how do you think he financed it? Of course, he started printing money. And this is where the addiction of Argentinian politicians printing bills came from. The fact is that during the first years of this entire process, and thanks to all the money that he injected into the economy, things seemed to be actually sailing pretty smoothly. So what was the problem? Well, it simply wasn't sustainable. The government overspent and the country's competitiveness began to sink like the Titanic. Within a few years, their positive balance vanished, private investment collapsed, and suddenly some prices started to skyrocket. So what do you think happened then? Do you think that given that his revolution didn't seem to be on the right track, Perón would take a bit of the blame? Well, no, he didn't at all. In fact, he blamed alleged speculators of attacking the national economy. And to remedy all of this, he multiplied the government controls, regulated prices, and implemented all kinds of measures that would even affect bread distribution. But, dear viewer, the crisis wasn't Perón's only problem. The 1853 Constitution didn't allow for a politician to stay in power, preventing an immediate re-election. So, under this scenario, what do you think he did? Well, listen to this. Along with the bill printing machine, Latin American politicians' second favorite toy is constituent reforms. And, of course, Perón was no exception. In 1949, since the previous constitution imposed too many obstacles, Perón launched a complete constitutional reform. The new constitution placed the state as the fundamental pillar of Argentine society. Even in the Constitution's own preamble, the three pillars of Juan Domingo Perón's political thesis were included. This was supposed to be a constitution for all. But let's take a look at the change's results. Investments had disappeared, the macro data just got worse, the country was in crisis, and public companies in Argentina underwent what the PDVSA, the Venezuelan state-owned oil and natural gas company, underwent. They simply weren't invested in, so they suffered from all kinds of influences, and in the end, they were very unproductive and inefficient, all to the detriment of the Argentines. In other words, the new model Juan Domingo Perón had implemented became a poverty-making machine. Of course, this all happened under the enormous cult of this leader. The reality, dear viewer, is that Argentine society was in crisis, and it was so fragmented that under these circumstances, in September of 1955, there was a new coup d'etat. This time, it was against Juan Domingo Perón.
Millares de personas asisten en la residencia presidencial a la muestra de la impresionante colección de riquezas atesoradas por el mandatario depuesto. El asombro de la multitud se exalta por pertenecer estas riquezas a quien basó su política en el mito de la humildad y la pobreza. Ya en los jardines se muestran ante nuestros ojos lujosísimos automóviles y toda clase de modelos de motocicletas y motonetas, vestidos, sombreros, zapatos y pieles que no sabemos si habrá logrado reunir ninguna reina de ningún país del mundo. Y aquí están las joyas, tasadas en más de 60 millones de pesos.
So you now might be thinking, well, this is the end of Perón. Well, if you're thinking that, you're actually mistaken, but we're going to talk about all of that in a future video. And I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please do hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for brand new videos. Also, please do check out our Patreon. Our channel is possible because of the people who support us over there, so find a link to that in the description below. And as always, thank you for watching.
El peronismo es la búsqueda de las igualdades de oportunidades, la búsqueda de la justicia social, la búsqueda de la pobreza cero en Argentina.